Well, welcome again to Messages of Hope from Pepperdine University. This is Jeff Walling, and this is week 14. It's been a crazy ride for the last couple of weeks. A lot of challenges, a lot of heartache, and protests all over our country. But this last week's protests were much more peaceful, and action seems to be taken in moving towards what we talked about last week, dealing with the sin of racism in our country and in our hearts. Not only that, but there was more heartbreak as we crossed the 2 million mark for the numbers of COVID cases. And here in the U.S., 115,000 dead, nearly 500,000 dead worldwide. The numbers are, well, they're just numbing at this point. But states are opening up. We are seeing more and more restaurants and churches. And so there are probably fewer and fewer of you who weren't able to actually go to church. And for those who couldn't go, I hope you did online. Maybe Zoom in with your congregation and you're supporting them during this time. I actually don't know how many more of these we'll do. If you're interested in us continuing to do this, let me encourage you to shoot a comment in there at YouTube, or you can even email me at jeff.walling@pepperdine.edu. But for the next couple of weeks at least, we'll continue to share lessons in the belief that there may be some whose churches have not opened yet, especially here in Southern California. Well, last week we talked about a negative legacy. This week we're going to talk about a positive legacy, or at least the hope of that. Last week we talked about what was behind us, and today I want to talk about what's ahead, which leads me to the topic of tombstones. Yeah, I know, seems like a non sequitur. You see, a tombstone is a place where a person gets to, if they plan ahead, choose how they want to be remembered. Maybe they'll pick a picture. Maybe they'll pick an interesting phrase. Maybe they'll want to say something about themselves or their family. Or maybe they didn't get a chance to pick their own tombstone, so their family will decide how to sum their life up. It raises an interesting question. How do you want to be remembered? I got online and started looking at some interesting tombstones. I want to share them with you. For instance, Don Knotts, a favorite actor of mine from Andy Griffith. This is what his tombstone looks like. Yeah, he decided to choose a bunch of images of different movies that he was in. Now, some tombstones are very political. I don't know who Bill Cuggle was, but he definitely was a man who didn't like Republicans, didn't want to have much to do with it, and he put it on his tombstone. Andrew Alsop, on the other hand, had a pretty vengeful tombstone. It seemed that he felt abandoned by his wife and children in his older years. And he said, "Man, may God have more understanding and mercy with you." Wow. Ooh, a lot of bitterness. And then there's some goofy tombstones, like this one. I don't know who the guy was, but he loved bacon. Or this one. Steve Jobs, we really don't know where he's buried, actually, but somebody decided they ought to put a tombstone there for him in the shape of an iPod. Some of them, oh, come on. I thought, really? Lawrence Cook's family decided to put something kind of humorous on his tombstone. Yeah, Ma loved Pa, Pa loved women, and Ma caught Pa with two of them swimming, and so here lies Pa. I'm hoping that whole thing was just a joke. My favorite of the interesting tombstones was a tombstone of a woman whose first name is the only one I know, Kay. Kay was so well loved as a cook, they put her fudge recipe on the tombstone. I get the feeling there may be some ladies out there trying to copy that down. What I love was what was there at the bottom, that wherever Kay went, there was laughter. Now, that's an epitaph. That's a way of saying what's important about your life. Now, some lives are bigger, well, at least by society standards. Not far from here is the Reagan Library, a place where room after room is dedicated to the good things that President Ronald Reagan did. But there are things that may be missing from some presidential libraries. If I had a library, what about you? I mean, if there was a library for the Jones family or the Smith family, a library for Karen Thompson or Carlos Marquez, or a library for the Wallings, I know there are things that I've done, there are goof-ups I've made that I hope There's not a whole wall dedicated to it. Like the time I fell off stage when I was preaching. Yeah, well, if you haven't seen that, just look up Jeff's Revelation on YouTube and you'll get a laugh out of it. It wasn't that funny when it happened. Because you see, I probably, like you, want to have good things said about me when I'm gone. I want to be remembered in positive tones. Well, here's the good news. Your legacy is still being written. If you're listening to me, if you're breathing, then you have a chance to decide, how do I want to live to leave a godly legacy behind? Now, you may think, well, exactly what do you mean when you say legacy? What is a legacy, Jeff? Well, if you look behind you, go ahead, just glance behind you. Your legacy is whatever you're leaving behind you, whatever you leave behind. Maybe a vision or a visual will help. Do you ever ride in a boat? My sweet father-in-law, who's dead and gone, used to have a little pontoon boat. And on occasion, we'd get a chance to go where they lived by a lake and ride in it. He even let me drive it. Now, one of the things that was around there was signs that said, now, no wakes here. I actually had to be educated on what a wake was. A wake is that spray of white water that comes behind a boat. A couple of facts about wakes. First, legacies are like the wakes behind a boat. They are always wider and longer than the vessel that made them. Take a look at this aerial shot. You can see that that boat is rather small compared to the length and breadth of that big wake that it leaves behind it. You see, our legacies will often go on longer than we live. You think of people like St. Francis, who has a legacy that is centuries old, or the Nazi Party, who has a legacy that will probably live in infamy for a long, long time. Martin Luther King has an amazing legacy, and his name is being spoken often, even now, how many years? 50, 60 years after the man has died. So, what does it mean that we are living in such a way to leave that wake behind us in a Christ-like and godly way? You see, the problem with legacies is that before you realize it, you've already made one. Yeah, it's kind of like driving a boat when you're not paying attention to behind you. Oh my goodness, look at the wake that I'm leaving. The problem with a legacy is that you make it before you realize it. The good news about legacy is that you've still got water ahead to decide what kind of wake you want to leave behind. Our text for this weekend is from Hebrews chapter 12. While you're finding it, let me set some background. The Hebrew letter is written to Jewish Christians, Christians who were scattered and some who were right there in Jerusalem. The Hebrew writer, we don't know who it is, so we just call him the Hebrew writer, writes a letter that basically says, hang in there. It was tough times for Christians in the days when the letter was written, maybe 30 to 40 years after the death of Jesus. There was persecution, there were plagues and diseases. Yeah, maybe think COVID-19 times. It was just plain tough. And people were asking the questions they always ask when that happens. Are we going to be okay? Is it worth me being a Christian in this tough time? And the big one, can Jesus really be trusted? Are His promises true? Well, the Hebrew writer shouts at the top of his lungs, yes. He says, Jesus is better than anything else you turn to. Jesus is better than any people or pursuits or objects or hopes that human beings can possibly give their allegiance to. He says Jesus is better than the angels. He has a better hope of salvation than the old law. Jesus is a better sacrifice for sin than bulls and goats. And Jesus offers a better inheritance than anybody else. Eternity in heaven for those who trust and obey Him. Now, he spends about the first 3/4 of the book making that argument. And then, in the last quarter of the book, he shifts his gears. He said, okay, I've told you that Jesus is better. Now let me show you why faith is so important. In chapter 11, he takes us into a graveyard of the faithful, the hall of faith, of legacies of people who trusted in God. It's as though he walks along and says, see that gravestone? You mean the one with the The boat on it, yeah, that's Noah. Let me tell you, he trusted God. You see that one over there, the older couple with the baby? That's Abraham and Sarah. They trusted in God. You see that one there, the fellow holding the 10 Commandments? That's Moses. And he trusted in God. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Joseph. By faith, Jacob. By faith, Sarah. Faith, 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 he says. And after taking us through the whole tour of these amazing Old Testament hero stories, he stops and looks at us in chapter 12 and says, now, how will you form the rest of your legacy? Well, listen to his words as he begins chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. As Paul often does, the writer of Hebrews chooses a running metaphor, a sports metaphor. It's a powerful picture. He imagines a stadium packed with people looking down on a foot race. The track is laid out, the runners are ready to go, the fans are on their feet, and he says what you have to do, because it's a long race, is to run with patience the race marked out for you. By the way, that phrase, marked out for you, he's quietly reminding us, we don't get to choose our race. You didn't get to choose where your race began, did you? You didn't pick your parents, nor did I. And we actually don't get to choose when we hit the finish line. For most of us, we won't know until we get there. He says there's a race marked out for you, much of which you can't control, but here's what you can control. How will you run your race? And that's where we leave a legacy. A legacy for sons and daughters, a legacy for grandkids, a legacy, older brothers for younger brothers, older sisters for those who come behind you. Grandpa and Grandma, you're leaving a wake behind your life, a legacy of how you're running your race. And if you say, well, okay, how do I run it well? Well, let's take the tips from the Hebrew writer that he's offering. 3 specifically. First, if you want to leave a godly legacy, if you want to pay it forward, because remember, there were folks who left you a legacy. There was a mom or a dad or a grandpa or grandma, someone who pointed you towards Jesus. And for many of us, those folks have gone on to glory. And now it's our turn to leave a legacy for those who are standing behind us. A legacy that first, according to the Hebrew writer, must include a clear commitment to faith in the unseen. This is how he starts chapter 11 in verse 1. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see. For the Hebrew writer, faith is the fuel of the runner. My son in high school ran cross country. My wife, of course, was a runner when she was in school and has still continued to do things like run marathons. It's amazing. But she knew about running and I didn't. And so when she said, we're going to have the cross-country team over for the night when they need to do carbo loading, I had no idea what carbo loading was. Well, carbo loading is what I normally did when I ate back in the day. I love carbohydrates, right? Oh yeah, breads and chips and potatoes and all that kind of stuff. Well, now they tell us we're supposed to stick with the proteins, except if you're a runner about to run a long-distance race. Then you need to give your body fuel, and the fuel you need is carbohydrates. She would make big pots of pasta, of spaghetti, and the boys would come and eat their fill because they needed that good fuel. So, how are you doing on fueling up yourself during this difficult time in our world's race? With the tensions of the challenges that we're seeing on TV, of racism, of violence, with the challenges of this virus and the fears all around us. Listen, if you're not doing some spiritual carbo loading, if you're not eating some holy pasta, you're going to wear out. And what is it? Well, what do you think? It's worship. It's prayer. It's Bible study. It's fellowship. It's all the things that feed your faith. It's finding good things to watch, maybe even finding good things to listen to. maybe praise music. I'm not going to dictate how to do it. We all have our own styles. But folks, if I don't feed my faith with the people I'm with, the things I hear, the things I watch, I will run out of soup and not be able to finish well. And it means trusting in the unseen. It means turning to the stories of this unseen cloud of witnesses around us. That cloud, I love that word. It's a word that describes surrounding, or rather the word surrounding as though you're wearing a garment. Because Joseph, David, Moses, they're all around us. They're here ready to run the race with us. They're not just witnesses in the watching sense. They're witnesses in the let me testify sense. Listening to them through the Word feeds our faith. Second, it is a legacy of ruthless elimination of weight. Not physical weight, but the weight of sin. Now, anybody who's watched professional swimmers or those bicyclists who fly, or maybe just even watched a good runner, knows that they try and eliminate as much weight as possible. Their outfits are very, very light. The shoes they wear are light. You ever picked up a bicyclist, a real pro bicyclist bicycle? You can do it with your finger because it weighs just ounces. Here's the racer's line. Ounces are inches. Every extra ounce is going to slow you down. That's why swimmers will actually shave their bodies, because those little hairs that we can barely see will slow them down. I read that bicyclists will shave their legs because it was determined that with an unshaved leg, your race, a 40-kilometer ride, which is not all that long for a rider, can take a minute and a half longer. You can shave literally 90 seconds off your race if you'll take off those little hairs on your leg that are slowing you down. Well, the Hebrew writer feels the same way about those little sins that are eating us alive, like a bunch of gnats. He says, throw off that weight. It's like carrying a backpack with a bunch of little rocks in it. My wife and my daughter-in-law, Megan, a couple of years ago, did about 55 miles on the Appalachian Trail in a week with a youth group. That's a long way to go backpacking. That's right, they weren't staying in hotels or motels. They had to carry all their food, they had to carry all their clothes, they had to carry their tent on their back. Some of those packs are 35 plus pounds. I was saying, here babe, why don't you take this and take that? And she's like, no. They go through a rigorous, ruthless study of what's in their pack with veteran backpackers who say, no, only take one of those. No, you don't need 2 pairs of those, just take one. Because every ounce on a 60-mile hike, every ounce matters. Listen to the Hebrew writer. Throw away, literally, it's just get rid of it, chuck it off. Everything that hinders you, and listen to this language, the sin that so easily entangles. That Greek word, euperistatos, means to get control of you, to tie you up like a fish that's been caught in a net. So what's tangling you this season that you just need to throw away so you can run faithfully this race during a difficult time? Anger, bitterness, greed, lust, deceit, prejudice. Friend, if you're carrying those things, if you're carrying vengeance, if you're carrying jealousy, it will weigh you down and wear you out, and you won't be able to run the race you could, the race that will leave a legacy. I can't make excuses. I can't say it doesn't matter, not to the Hebrew writer. He says you've got to throw off everything that hinders you, that so easily entangles you, and instead fix your eyes on Jesus. Now that's the third and last tip. A legacy of a consistent focus on Christ. Here's how he finishes up the text we're looking at today. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Ah, there's the phrase, right? Lose heart. Paul uses it, the Hebrew writer uses it, and he says it's going to happen if you get worn out spiritually and you don't keep your eyes on Jesus. Maybe here's the image we can take home with us. Those runners that are up in the stands, Peter, Paul, Esther, Sarah. As you get tired, they come down to run by you. I had a friend who ran a marathon, and he knew that it was going to get tough when he got up to mile 18, 19, 20, 21. That's when the marathoners hit the wall. And so he had people who loved him, people he cared about, who when he got to mile 16, one of them came and ran alongside him for a mile. When he got to mile 19, a dear friend ran along with him. When he got to mile 20, his wife came out and ran with him a bit. And at mile 22, one of his kids came and ran with him. A best friend stepped out at mile 23. And at mile 24, his dad was there to jog along for a little bit to say, don't give up. I want you to take that image and imagine that Peter steps in when you're tired and frustrated and about to cuss out the kids and says, come on, friend. Remember what I did. Don't make my mistake. I want you to imagine that Abraham comes alongside you when your body is frustrating you and age is just wearing you out, and he says, come on now, brother. Come on, sister. You can make it through. When you're scared and nervous, Esther comes down from the stands and runs a lap with you. When you're tempted, David comes and says, let me run this lap with you, and reminds you that is not going to be a good choice for you. But the best moment of all is when we fix our eyes on Jesus. And He comes down and says, let's run this lap together. And He reminds us of what He went through. Listen again to the text. Consider Him who endured such opposition from sinful men so that you will not grow weary. He says, if you'll think about what Jesus went through, if you'll let Him run alongside of you and remind you, beaten, whipped, mocked, tortured, crucified, worn out to the point where all I want is a drink of water. If we will look at what Jesus went through. I don't know what the difficulties are that black members of my community and church are facing. I don't know what it feels like to be 80 or 90. I don't know what it feels like to be an immigrant in America. I don't know what it feels like to be a woman in the church today. But Jesus knows what all of those difficulties feel like. He knows what it feels like to be overlooked, to be minimized, to be tortured, to be killed. My Jesus knows what I feel and what I need. Will you this week let Him run alongside you? Your legacy is too important not to listen. And for those who may be saying, well, Jeff, you should have preached me that lesson about 40 years ago. I'm in my last lap. My legacy is all but written. Don't you dare think it's too late. It's not. Amazing Grace is a beautiful song. It's been sung for years, and especially during the Civil Rights Movement. Amazing Grace was a song that many black churches took up as a song of hope. I don't know how many of them knew that the writer of Amazing Grace was a slave trader. Not when he wrote it. A gentleman named John Newton, who was a slave trader, a scoundrel, a drunkard. When he was a captain on one ship, his people hated him so badly, those that worked for him, that when he was washed overboard, they argued about whether to save him, and somebody finally said, I'll save him, and shot him with a harpoon and pulled him back in the boat. Now that's when you know the sailors don't like you. Oh, he was a miserable wretch, according to his own words, until he came in contact with the grace of God. And then he became a minister, wrote a number of beautiful songs, but the most well-known, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saves a wretch a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Late in his life, John Newton wrote this: I am not the man I ought to be. I am not the man I wish to be. And I am not the man I hope to be. But by the grace of God, I am not the man I used to be. Decide this week that you're going to take a legacy step. You're going to trust in the God we cannot see, ruthlessly get rid of the stuff that's weighing you down, and put your eyes on Jesus. The author of Amazing Grace would tell you it's not too late to write another verse to your song. May God bless you, and may this week be a week for your legacy.